Some ghosts aren't born from death. They're born from the living who refuse to let go. Deep in Washington's Cascade Mountains, where cell towers fear to reach and civilization becomes just a memory, Marcus Thornfield knelt in 3 feet of fresh powder beside a weathered wooden cross. The blizzard had finally stopped after 2 days of relentless fury, leaving the world wrapped in an eerie, crystalline silence that only the wilderness knows. His weathered hands shook as he brushed snow from the makeshift grave marker, tears freezing on his bearded cheeks before they could fall. For 3 years, Marcus had lived as a ghost himself, guiding the occasional lost hiker back to safety while avoiding the very people he'd once sworn to protect. The guilt of losing Elena had hollowed him out, turned him into something more wolf than man. But as he whispered his daily apology to the woman he'd failed to save, he had no idea that Elena stood just 10 feet behind him, watching with the same gentle smile she'd worn on their wedding day. The question that haunts every love story isn't whether love conquers all, it's whether some loves are too powerful to die. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind had died completely, leaving behind a silence so profound that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat drumming against his ribs. He remained kneeling in the snow, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the brittle air. The wooden cross bore Elena's name in letters he'd carved with his own trembling hands 3 winters ago, deep grooves that had weathered to a silvery grey, matching the color of his grief. "I should have known better," he whispered to the grave, his voice barely disturbing the crystalline air. "Should have read the signs. The wind patterns were all wrong that morning, but I was so damn eager to show you that hidden lake." Behind him, Elena tilted her head slightly, the gesture achingly familiar. She wore the same red wool jacket she'd died in, the same hiking boots that had failed to find purchase on the icy slope. Her dark hair caught what little light filtered through the heavy cloud cover, and if Marcus had turned around, he would have seen that her lips moved silently, forming words of forgiveness he couldn't hear. But Marcus didn't turn around. He never did during these daily visits. The guilt was too heavy, too consuming. Instead, he pulled a thermos from his pack and poured steaming coffee onto the snow beside the cross, a ritual he'd performed every day for 3 years, weather permitting. "Found another body yesterday," he continued, his voice growing rougher. "Young woman, maybe 25. Sarah Chen from Seattle. Been missing since October." He paused, watching the coffee melt through the snow in dark rivulets. "3rd one this winter. Something's not right up here, Elena. People don't just disappear like that. Not experienced hikers." Elena's expression shifted, a flicker of something urgent crossing her features. She took a step closer, her boots making no sound in the snow despite leaving clear impressions. If Marcus had been paying attention, he might have noticed that her footprints were too perfect, too precisely formed, as if they'd been pressed into the snow by something other than weight and motion. The Coleman family had hired Marcus to find Sarah after the official search and rescue operation had been called off. He'd discovered her body in a ravine that shouldn't have been accessible from any marked trail, her equipment scattered in a pattern that spoke of panic rather than accident. The local authorities had chalked it up to another case of an inexperienced hiker biting off more than she could chew, but Marcus knew better. Sarah's gear was top of the line, and her hiking resume included successful summits in Alaska and Colorado. "Sheriff Kowalski thinks I'm losing my mind," Marcus said, absently packing snow around the base of the cross where the wind had eroded it. "Maybe he's right. Maybe grief does things to a man's judgment. But I know what I saw out there." The temperature was dropping again as afternoon faded toward evening. Marcus could feel it in his bones, in the way the snow crunched differently under his weight. Another storm was building to the west. He could smell it on the air, that particular metallic scent that preceded heavy snowfall in the high country. He should head back to his cabin before the weather turned, but leaving Elena always felt like abandonment. Even if she was just bones and memory beneath the snow, even if these one-sided conversations were the ravings of a madman, she was all he had left of the life he'd destroyed. "I keep thinking about the avalanche," he admitted, pulling his wool cap down over his ears. About the sound it made when it started to slide, like the mountain itself was screaming. His voice broke slightly. Sometimes I wake up hearing that sound, and for just a second, I think maybe I can warn you. Maybe I can change what happened. Elena reached out as if to touch his shoulder, her hand stopping just inches from the worn fabric of his jacket. The gesture was full of longing, of a love that had somehow survived the ultimate separation. When she spoke, her voice was carried away by a wind that Marcus couldn't feel. "You couldn't have known," she whispered to the gathering dusk. "It wasn't your fault." But Marcus was already standing, shouldering his pack with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent more years in the wilderness than in civilization. He touched the top of the cross one final time, a gesture both tender and desperate. "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised, as he always did, weather permitting. As he started down the narrow trail toward his cabin, his snowshoes leaving deep prints in the virgin powder, Elena remained by her grave. She watched him go with infinite patience, as she had every day for 3 years. When he disappeared around the bend, she looked down at the coffee stain in the snow, at the place where love and guilt intersected in a daily ritual of mourning. The first flakes of new snow began to fall, and Elena lifted her face to meet them. Unlike Marcus, she felt no cold, no sting of ice against her skin. She felt only the pull of unfinished business and the weight of truth that demanded to be told. The trail down to Marcus's cabin had been worn into his muscle memory through 3 years of identical journeys. Even as the new snow began to fall in earnest, obscuring the familiar landmarks, his feet found each twist and depression without conscious thought. The snowshoes moved in their practiced rhythm, lift, step, plant, while his mind remained fixed on the grave behind him, as it always did during these solitary descents. By the time he reached the clearing where his cabin squatted like a weathered boulder among the pines, the snowfall had thickened into the kind of heavy, determined precipitation that meant business. Marcus paused at his front door, brushing snow from his shoulders and stomping his boots on the covered porch. The routine was as automatic as breathing: gear check, weather assessment, mental inventory of supplies, storm protocol, honed by decades of mountain living. Inside, the cabin held the particular chill of a fire gone cold. Marcus moved through the familiar choreography of evening preparation: kindling, newspaper, the careful architecture of split pine that would catch quickly and burn hot. The match flame danced against his weathered features as he coaxed the fire to life, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with topographical maps and worn paperbacks. The cabin itself was a testament to solitude: 2 rooms, a loft for sleeping, and everything a man needed to survive in isolation. No telephone. Cell towers couldn't reach this elevation anyway. No internet, no television. Just a battery-powered radio for weather reports and the occasional check-in with the outside world. Marcus had built this place with his own hands 15 years ago, back when Elena had still been alive to help him choose the site, to hold the other end of the measuring tape, to laugh at his struggles with the cabin's temperamental wood stove. Now the silence felt different, not peaceful, but expectant, as if the walls themselves were waiting for Elena's voice to fill the empty spaces. Marcus hung his jacket on its designated peg and opened a can of beef stew, emptying it into a battered saucepan. While it heated, he studied the collection of missing person flyers scattered across his kitchen table. 5 faces stared back at him. Sarah Chen was just the latest. Before her, David Martinez, an experienced climber from Portland; Jennifer Walsh, a survival instructor from Vancouver; Thomas Brennan, a former Army Ranger who'd survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, only to vanish on what should have been a routine day hike. Each disappearance followed a similar pattern: experienced hikers, well-equipped, following established trails. All had checked in with someone, family, friends, trail registers, before vanishing completely. The official search and rescue efforts had been thorough but fruitless, as if these people had simply been erased from existence. Only Marcus's unofficial searches, funded by desperate families, had managed to recover any bodies at all. The stew began to bubble, and Marcus stirred it absently while his eyes traced the red pins on the large map mounted above his table. Each pin marked a last known location, a recovery site, a piece of the puzzle that refused to come together. The pattern was there. He could feel it like pressure before a storm, but every time he thought he was close to understanding, the connections slipped away like smoke. Sheriff Kowalski thought Marcus was chasing ghosts, projecting his guilt over Elena's death onto a series of unrelated accidents. Maybe he was right. Maybe the isolation was finally getting to Marcus, turning coincidence into conspiracy, normal mountain dangers into something more sinister. God knew he'd seen it happen to other long-time wilderness guides, men who'd spent so much time alone with their thoughts that reality began to bend around their obsessions. But Elena hadn't been inexperienced. She'd been hiking these mountains since childhood, knew the terrain better than most rangers. The avalanche that killed her had come down in conditions that should have been stable, triggered by forces that still didn't make sense 3 years later. Marcus ate his stew standing at the counter, watching through the window as the storm gathered strength. The wind had picked up again, driving the snow horizontally across the clearing. This would be a heavy one, possibly heavy enough to keep him cabin-bound for days. The thought should have been comforting. Storm days meant no responsibilities, no clients, no need to venture out and pretend he was holding his life together. Instead, he felt only the familiar weight of anticipation that had nothing to do with weather patterns. Tomorrow would bring another visit to Elena's grave, another one-sided conversation, another day of moving through routines that felt increasingly hollow. The coffee ritual, the promise to return, the careful maintenance of grief like tending a sacred flame. Outside, the wind howled through the pines with a voice that sounded almost human, almost familiar. Marcus set down his empty bowl and pressed his face to the cold glass, but the storm had swallowed the world beyond his porch light. Whatever waited out there in the darkness would have to wait until morning. The fire crackled behind him, and for just a moment, Marcus could have sworn he heard the soft whisper of Elena's laughter carried on the wind. Marcus stepped back from the window, shaking his head at his own imagination. 3 years of solitude had a way of turning wind through pine needles into familiar voices, of making every storm sound like conversations with the dead. He was reaching for his empty bowl when 3 sharp knocks echoed through the cabin. The sound cut through the storm's howling like gunshots. Marcus froze, his hand suspended halfway to the counter. In 15 years of living at this elevation, no one had ever knocked on his door during a blizzard. Hell, most people couldn't even find his cabin in good weather without GPS coordinates and detailed directions. The knocking came again, deliberate, urgent, unmistakably real. Marcus grabbed his jacket and the flashlight from beside the door. Through the peephole, he could see nothing but swirling snow, but someone was definitely out there. He could hear boots stamping on his porch, the muffled sound of labored breathing. "Who's there?" he called through the heavy wooden door. "Please," came a woman's voice, barely audible above the wind. "I'm lost. I saw your light." Marcus unlatched the deadbolt and opened the door to reveal a young woman in her 20s, Asian features sharp with cold and exhaustion. Her jacket was expensive outdoor gear, but she was trembling violently, snow caked in her black hair and eyebrows. What struck him immediately was how she'd managed to reach his cabin at all. The nearest trail was a mile away, and in these conditions, navigation would be nearly impossible. "Jesus Christ," Marcus muttered, stepping aside. "Get in here before you freeze to death." She stumbled through the doorway, and Marcus caught her elbow to steady her. Her skin was ice cold even through her gloves. He guided her to the chair nearest the fire and began stripping off her wet outer layers, jacket, hat, gloves, with the efficient movements of someone who'd dealt with hypothermia before. "What's your name?" he asked, wrapping a wool blanket around her shoulders. "Amy," she said through chattering teeth. "Amy Nakamura. I was hiking the Cascade Trail when the storm hit, got turned around in the snow." Marcus nodded, already moving toward the kitchen to heat water for tea. The Cascade Trail was a reasonable explanation, though it still didn't explain how she'd found his cabin in near whiteout conditions. "You alone out there?" "My hiking partner." Amy's voice caught. "Sarah went ahead to check the trail. We got separated when the visibility dropped. I've been looking for her for hours." Marcus's hand stilled on the kettle. Sarah? Sarah Chen. She's experienced, knows these mountains, but Amy looked up at him with desperate eyes. You have to help me find her. She's been out there alone since this afternoon. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sarah Chen. The same Sarah Chen whose body he'd found in an impossible ravine just yesterday. The same Sarah Chen who'd been missing since October, not this afternoon. He set the kettle down carefully, his mind racing through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Amy, he said slowly. What's today's date? She looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. December 15th. Why? We need to... Sarah Chen went missing 3 months ago, Marcus interrupted. I found her body yesterday. The color drained from Amy's face. That's impossible. I was just hiking with her. We started from the Cascade Ridge trailhead this morning and... She stopped, pressing her hands to her temples. I don't understand. This morning. It was this morning, wasn't it? Marcus studied her carefully. Either Amy was suffering from severe hypothermia-induced confusion, or something far stranger was happening. Her gear was wrong, too clean, too new, as if it had never seen real use. And now that she was warming up, he noticed other details that didn't fit. Her skin had the pallor of someone who'd been cold for a long time, not just a few hours. Her boots showed no signs of the kind of wear that would come from hiking for hours through deep snow. Amy, I need you to think carefully. When did you last remember eating, sleeping, checking the time? She stared into the fire, her expression growing more troubled. We had breakfast at the trailhead, coffee from a thermos. Sarah was excited about reaching the summit before the storm hit. Her voice became uncertain. But that feels like longer ago than it should. Outside, the storm was reaching its full fury, but Marcus barely heard it. He was thinking about Elena, about the footprints that led to impossible places, about the way grief could manifest things that shouldn't exist. He was thinking about Amy's too clean gear, and her confusion about time, about the growing collection of missing hikers, and the patterns that refused to make sense. Most of all, he was thinking about the choice now facing him: treat Amy as a hypothermic hiker in need of rescue, or acknowledge that something supernatural was happening in his mountains, something that might finally explain Elena's impossible presence at her own grave. The fire crackled between them, and Marcus made his decision. Marcus stared at Amy across the flickering firelight, his decision crystallizing and then immediately crumbling under the weight of what it might mean. The rational part of his mind, the part trained by decades of mountain rescue, of dealing with real emergencies and concrete problems, insisted he was looking at a hypothermic woman who needed medical attention, not supernatural intervention. But the other part, the part that had been growing stronger since Elena's death, whispered that Amy Nakamura was something else entirely, something impossible. I need to contact search and rescue, he said finally, moving toward the radio on his kitchen counter. It was the safe choice, the sane choice. Let someone else determine whether Amy belonged to the world of the living or something far more complicated. No. Amy's voice was sharp enough to cut through his resolve. Please, not yet. I need to understand what's happening to me first. Marcus's hand froze on the radio dial. The desperation in her voice was too real, too immediate to ignore. He'd heard that same tone from dozens of lost hikers over the years, the moment when they realized their situation was far worse than they'd imagined. But Amy's desperation felt different. It wasn't the fear of being lost in a storm, it was the terror of being lost in reality itself. Tell me about the last thing you remember clearly, Marcus said, abandoning the radio. Before you found my cabin. Amy pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Sarah and I were following the trail markers. The snow was getting heavier, but we thought we could make it to the emergency shelter at Ridgepoint before it got really bad. She paused, her brow furrowing. But then, everything gets confused. I remember calling her name over and over. I remember the sound echoing off the rocks, but no answer. And then... Then what? Then I was walking, but I don't remember deciding which direction to go. It was like watching someone else's feet in the snow. And your light, I saw it through the trees, but it felt like I'd been walking toward it for hours, maybe days. Amy looked up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone who'd supposedly been hiking since morning. Time doesn't work right, does it? When you're... She didn't finish the sentence, but Marcus heard the unspoken word hanging between them like smoke. Dead. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and Marcus found himself thinking about Elena again. About the way she always appeared at her grave with that same confused expression, as if she couldn't quite understand why she was there or how long she'd been waiting. About the footprints that led to places no living person could reach, but seemed perfectly natural to someone who no longer followed the rules of physics. Sarah Chen disappeared 3 months ago, Marcus said carefully. Her family hired me to find her after the official search was called off. I've been tracking missing hikers all winter, and they all follow the same pattern. Experienced people, good equipment, vanishing without explanation. Amy's breathing became shallow, but I was just with her. We shared coffee this morning. She was telling me about her job at the tech company, about the promotion she was hoping for. Her voice trailed off as she seemed to hear her own words. She was telling me about things that sounded old, like she was remembering them from a long time ago. The storm rattled the windows, and Marcus felt the familiar weight of a choice that would change everything. He could keep pretending this was a normal rescue situation, call for help, and watch as Amy either disappeared into the bureaucracy of missing persons cases or simply vanished entirely when dawn came. He could maintain the illusion that his world still operated according to natural laws. Or he could acknowledge what his gut had been telling him for months, that Elena's death had torn something open in these mountains, creating a space where the impossible became routine. The problem was the stakes. If he was wrong, if Amy was just a confused, hypothermic hiker, then his reluctance to call for immediate help could cost her life. But if he was right, if she was something more than human, then involving authorities might expose truths that destroy what little sanity he had left. I've been seeing my dead wife, Marcus admitted suddenly. Elena. She appears at her grave every time I visit, never speaks, never acknowledges me, but she's there. Real enough to leave footprints. Amy stared at him. Do you think I'm like her? I don't know what to think anymore. Marcus sank into the chair across from her. I've spent 3 years convincing myself I was losing my mind. But now you're here, confused about time, hiking with someone who died months ago, and I'm starting to wonder if the mountains are trying to tell me something I've been too afraid to hear. Outside, the storm reached a new level of fury, as if responding to his admission. And somewhere in the howling wind, Marcus could have sworn he heard Elena's voice calling his name. The sound of Elena's voice in the wind should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like permission. Marcus stood slowly, his decision settling into his bones with the weight of falling snow. For 3 years he'd been tiptoeing around the edges of impossibility, making excuses, clinging to rational explanations that grew thinner each time Elena appeared at her grave. But sitting across from Amy Nakamura, whose confusion about time and reality mirrored his dead wife's silent presence, he finally understood that rationality had become a prison. We're going out there, he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Amy blinked. In this storm? Not to search for Sarah. She's beyond that kind of help. Marcus moved to his gear closet, pulling out extra layers, rope, his emergency beacon. But if you're like Elena, if you're caught between worlds somehow, then maybe being near where it happened might give us answers. The words felt strange on his tongue, but they also felt right. For the first time since Elena's death, he was choosing action over paralysis, mystery over denial. He wasn't going to sit in his cabin pretending Amy was just another hypothermic hiker while the mountains whispered secrets he'd spent years refusing to hear. You think I'm dead? Amy's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. Marcus paused in his preparations. I think you might not be entirely alive. There's a difference. He turned to face her. Elena leaves footprints. Feels real when I'm close enough. But she can't speak, can't interact. You're different. You can talk, make choices, affect things. Maybe that means something. Amy unwrapped herself from the blanket and stood. Her movements were more fluid now, less like someone fighting hypothermia, and more like someone remembering how their body worked. The last clear thing I remember is feeling terrified. Not of being lost, but of something hunting us. Sarah felt it too. She kept looking over her shoulder, kept saying the trail felt wrong. Marcus handed her the waterproof jacket he'd retrieved from his closet. "We're on the Cascade Trail. The section that runs along Devil's Drop. There's that narrow ledge where the trail cuts through the rock face." Amy accepted the jacket, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was warming now, but there was still something not quite right about her touch, a coldness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than weather. Sarah was ahead of me when the snow got heavy. I heard her scream once, and then nothing. Devil's Drop. Marcus knew it well, a technical section where the trail hugged a cliff face above a 100-foot ravine. In good conditions it was challenging but manageable. In a blizzard it would be suicide to attempt. But Amy wasn't describing good conditions or normal circumstances. She was describing the kind of place where the impossible might bleed through into reality. "That's a 3-mile hike in this weather," Marcus said, checking his headlamp batteries. "Could take hours. You don't have to." "Yes, I do." The words came out harder than he'd intended. Marcus softened his tone. "I've been running from answers for 3 years. Visiting Elena's grave, watching her appear and disappear, telling myself I was grieving normally. But normal grief doesn't leave footprints in the snow. Normal grief doesn't bring confused hikers to my door in the middle of blizzards." He strapped on his snowshoes, the familiar routine calming his nerves. "If there's something in these mountains that's keeping people trapped between life and death, if Elena's stuck in some kind of limbo because of the avalanche, then I need to understand it. Not as a search and rescue operation, but as something bigger." Amy was watching him with an expression he recognized, the look of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing they had to jump but terrified of the fall. What if we don't find answers? What if we just find more questions? Marcus shouldered his pack, feeling the weight of emergency gear, food, and the GPS tracker that probably wouldn't work once they entered whatever space existed between normal reality and the realm of the dead. Then at least we'll stop pretending we don't see what's right in front of us. The storm was waiting for them beyond the cabin door, not just weather anymore, but a portal into something that would demand everything he thought he knew about love, death, and the places where they intersected. Marcus had spent 3 years as a prisoner of his own guilt and grief, treating Elena's appearances as hallucinations instead of messages. But Amy had changed that. Her presence made Elena's impossible existence feel less like madness and more like evidence of a truth he'd been too afraid to investigate. Marcus opened the door, and the wind rushed in like a living thing, carrying the scent of snow and something else, something that smelled like Elena's perfume and sounded like whispered promises. "Ready?" he asked Amy. She nodded, and together they stepped into the storm, leaving behind the last pretense that Marcus Thornfield lived in a world governed by natural laws. The storm embraced them like a living entity, its wind carrying voices that might have been human, or might have been something else entirely. Within 50 yards of the cabin, Marcus's carefully maintained trail markers disappeared beneath snow that fell not just from above, but seemed to materialize from the air itself, defying every weather pattern he'd learned in 30 years on these mountains. Amy moved beside him with an eerie confidence, her snowshoes finding purchase on terrain that should have been treacherous. When Marcus's headlamp beam swept across her face, her eyes reflected the light like an animal's, not quite natural, but not entirely wrong either. The GPS stopped working, Marcus called over the wind, checking the device that had guided him through countless rescues. The screen showed only static where satellite signals should have been. "We don't need it," Amy replied, her voice carrying impossibly well through the storm. "I can feel the way." That should have worried him more than it did. Instead, Marcus found himself following her lead as they climbed through snow that reached his thighs toward a section of mountain that grew stranger with each step. The trees around them were wrong, too tall, their branches reaching at angles that hurt to look at directly, and the cold was changing, becoming less about temperature and more about something that pressed against his consciousness like ice-cold fingers. They'd been hiking for an hour when Marcus realized they weren't alone. The first figure appeared between the trees to their left, a man in climbing gear, standing perfectly still despite the driving snow. Marcus's headlamp beam passed right through him without casting a shadow. When Marcus blinked, the figure was gone. But the impression lingered, someone familiar, someone he'd searched for during one of the failed rescue operations from years past. "Did you see?" Marcus began. "David Reeves," Amy finished. "He's been following us since we left the cabin. And there's a woman behind us, Clara something. She fell through ice 5 winters ago." Marcus's breath caught. Clara Henley had been one of his first unsuccessful searches, a day hiker who disappeared near a frozen creek. Her body had never been found, and the case had haunted him for months. "How do you know their names?" "They told me." Amy's matter-of-fact tone made the impossible sound routine, not with words. "But when you're like this, communication works differently. They're curious about you, about why a living person can see us clearly." The word confirmed what Marcus had suspected, but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Amy wasn't a lost hiker. She was something else, something that belonged to the growing collection of missing people who'd found their way into a space between life and death. "Are they dangerous?" Marcus asked, though he kept walking. Whatever came next, it had to be better than 3 more years of willful ignorance. "I don't think so. Confused, mostly. They remember dying, but they also remember being alive, and they can't reconcile the difference." Amy paused to adjust her jacket, a gesture so normal it was jarring in the context of their conversation. Some have been here longer than others. The ones who've been here longest barely remember being human at all. The trail began to climb more steeply, following the route toward Devil's Drop, but the landscape around them was shifting in ways that had nothing to do with weather or darkness. Rock formations appeared that Marcus had never seen before, despite having hiked this area hundreds of times. The sound of the wind carried echoes of conversations, fragments of final moments, last words spoken into storms that had claimed their speakers. And through it all, Marcus began to sense a presence that felt different from the confused spirits Amy had described, something larger, more purposeful, a consciousness that had been waiting for him to stop running from the truth. "Elena," he whispered, and the wind died to nothing. In the sudden silence, Marcus heard footsteps behind them. Not Amy's careful movement through the snow, not the lost spirits who flickered in and out of existence. These were deliberate, familiar, the sound of someone who'd walked these mountains in life, and continued walking them in whatever came after. Marcus turned, his headlamp cutting through snow that now fell in perfect vertical lines, and saw her. Elena stood 20 feet away, exactly as she'd looked the morning of the avalanche. But this time, instead of the silent observation he'd grown accustomed to, she raised her hand and pointed deeper into the storm, toward Devil's Drop and the answers Marcus had spent 3 years avoiding. For the first time since her death, Elena spoke. "Follow me, Marcus. It's time you learned what really happened." Amy grabbed his arm, her grip solid, real, anchoring him to whatever reality they now occupied. "She's different from the rest of us," Amy said quietly. "Stronger. She's been waiting for you to be ready." Marcus looked into his dead wife's eyes and finally understood. This had never been about grief or guilt or impossible manifestations. It had been about preparation. Elena had been teaching him to see beyond the natural world, because something in these mountains required that sight to comprehend. And now, finally ready to learn the rules of this new existence, Marcus followed his wife into the storm. Elena moved through the storm-twisted landscape with the fluid grace of someone no longer bound by physical limitations, her feet leaving prints in snow that immediately filled with shadows instead of fresh powder. Marcus and Amy followed, their breathing harsh in the thin air, while Elena showed no signs of exertion, another reminder that whatever she had become transcended the needs of flesh and blood. The terrain grew increasingly impossible as they climbed. Cliff faces appeared where Marcus remembered gentle slopes, and the trail split into paths that led in directions his compass couldn't identify. But Elena navigated these impossibilities with certainty, leading them through spaces that existed in the gaps between what was real and what should be real. "Marcus," Amy said, her voice tight with strain, "the other spirits. They're following us now. A lot of them." He could feel them without looking back. A growing procession of the lost and confused dead, drawn by Elena's purposeful movement through their twilight realm. David Reeves walked among them, along with Clara Henley, and faces Marcus recognized from missing person files that had haunted his cabin walls for years. They weren't threatening, but their presence created a weight in the air, a pressure of unfinished business and unresolved questions. Elena stopped at what should have been the approach to Devil's Drop, but the landscape had transformed into something that belonged more to nightmare than geography. The familiar cliff face had stretched upward into infinity, its rock walls carved with symbols that hurt to perceive directly. And at the base of this impossible formation, Marcus saw something that made his heart clench with recognition and terror. The avalanche debris field, but not as it had appeared 3 years ago. This version existed in a state of permanent collapse, snow and rocks and shattered trees suspended in mid-fall, as if the moment of Elena's death had been frozen in time and stretched into a physical space that could be entered and explored. "This is where it happened," Elena said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "But not how you remember it." Marcus stared at the suspended catastrophe, understanding flooding through him with sickening clarity. The avalanche. It's still happening. "Time works differently here," Amy said quietly. "Traumatic moments create fractures, places where the normal flow breaks down and gets stuck in loops." She gestured toward the frozen debris field. "People who die in these fractures don't move on properly. They get trapped in the moment of their death, experiencing it over and over." Elena turned to face them, and Marcus saw past the familiar features to something vast and patient that had been watching him for years. "But it wasn't an accident, Marcus. The avalanche was triggered, deliberately, and the person responsible has been using these fractures to hide his crimes for decades." The weight of implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. All the missing hikers, all the failed searches, all the impossible disappearances that had eaten away at his professional confidence and personal sanity. They weren't random tragedies or natural disasters. They were murder, hidden behind supernatural phenomena that no one would believe or investigate. "Who?" The word came out as a growl. "Who did this to you? To all of them?" Elena's expression shifted, showing him glimpses of the woman he'd loved overlaid with something that had learned. Terrible truths about the nature of death and justice. "Someone you trust. Someone who's been part of every search operation, who's had access to trail information and hiking schedules, who's been able to guide victims to the fracture points where they could be killed without their bodies ever being found." The procession of dead hikers pressed closer, their faces showing hunger for answers, for justice, for someone among the living to finally understand what had been done to them. Marcus felt their collective grief and rage like a physical force, but underneath it lay something else, hope that Elena's stronger presence and Marcus's ability to bridge the world of the living and the dead might finally provide the resolution they'd been seeking. Amy gripped his arm tighter. "Marcus, something's coming, something that doesn't belong to this place." Through the storm, Marcus heard the distant sound of snowmobile engines, mechanical noise that seemed obscenely normal in the context of their supernatural journey. But Elena's expression shifted to something approaching fear, and the collected spirits began to fade back into the shadows between the falling snow. "He knows you're here," Elena said urgently. "He's been watching the cabin, waiting to see if you'd finally start asking the right questions. Coming here, bringing Amy. It's forced his hand." The engine sounds grew louder, accompanied by the harsh glare of artificial lights cutting through the storm. Marcus realized with growing horror that their journey into the realm of the dead had been observed, that their quest for answers had painted targets on their backs. "The fracture," Elena said, gesturing toward the suspended avalanche. "It's the only place he can't follow us with machines. But, Marcus, if you enter it, You risk becoming trapped like the rest of us." The lights were close now, and Marcus could hear voices calling his name through mechanical amplification. Professional, authoritative voices he recognized. The approaching threat would force him to choose between the safety of the living world and the terrible truths that could only be found among the dead. The voices through the mechanical amplification resolved into clarity, and Marcus's blood turned to ice water in his veins. "Marcus Thornfield. This is Deputy Chief Kowalski with Mountain Rescue. We know you're out here with the missing hiker. For your safety and hers, make yourself known immediately." Jake Kowalski, his former partner, his oldest friend in the rescue service, the man who'd stood beside him at Elena's memorial service and helped him through the darkest months of grief. The man who'd been part of every failed search operation, who'd had access to every hiking permit and trail schedule, who'd known exactly where to find victims when the storms rolled in. "No," Marcus whispered, but Elena's grim nod confirmed what his heart already knew. 23 years, she said, her voice heavy with accumulated sorrow. 23 years of using his position to hunt people in these mountains. He triggers avalanches, creates icefalls, causes the accidents that feed the fractures. And then he leads the search teams away from where the bodies actually are. The snowmobile engines grew deafening, their lights creating harsh shadows that made the suspended avalanche debris seem to writhe and shift. Amy pulled Marcus toward the fracture, but he found himself paralyzed by the magnitude of betrayal. He was there, Marcus said, memory reshaping itself around this new truth. The day Elena died. He suggested that trail, said the weather window was perfect, that we should go for the summit route instead of the safer valley path. And when the avalanche hit, Elena continued, he was positioned exactly where he needed to be to trigger the secondary slide that cut off your escape route. He made sure you'd blame yourself instead of looking for the real cause. The lights were close enough now that Marcus could make out individual snowmobiles, 3 of them, moving with the coordinated precision of a professional operation. But this wasn't a rescue. This was a cleanup. "Marcus!" Kowalski's voice boomed again. "We found blood at your cabin. If you're injured, we need to get you medical attention. Don't let hypothermia cloud your judgment." Blood. Marcus touched his temple where he'd struck the doorframe hours ago. Was it hours? Time had become meaningless in this space between worlds. But a small cut wouldn't produce the kind of blood evidence that justified this level of response, unless someone had planted it, unless someone had been preparing a narrative about what happened to Marcus Thornfield and the missing hiker he'd tried to save. "He can't let you live," Amy said, her earlier confusion replaced by sharp clarity. "You've seen too much, learned too much. And with me here as proof that the dead can return." She gestured toward the growing crowd of spirits surrounding them. "He'll lose control of his hunting ground." The first snowmobile crested the ridge above them, its headlight cutting through the supernatural storm like a blade. Marcus saw Jake Kowalski's familiar silhouette, but also 2 other figures, men he didn't recognize carrying equipment that looked more suited to combat than rescue work. "The fracture, Marcus," Elena urged. "It's the only place he can't follow." Marcus stared at the suspended avalanche, at the moment of Elena's death frozen in time and space. Everything he'd learned about love, loss, and the terrible persistence of guilt led to this choice. Enter the fracture and risk becoming trapped forever in the moment that had defined his grief, or stay in the world of the living and face a friend-turned-predator who would kill him to protect decades of hidden murder. The spirits of the dead pressed closer, their collective yearning for justice creating a pull stronger than gravity. David Reeves, Clara Henley, and dozens of others Marcus had failed to save, all of them victims not of natural disaster, but of calculated predation. Their faces showed him what Jake Kowalski really was, a creature who fed on tragedy, who used the wilderness as his personal hunting preserve, who had turned Marcus's dedication to saving lives into an unwitting tool for concealing death. A rifle shot cracked through the storm, the bullet striking the snow inches from Marcus's feet. Not a warning shot, a miss. Kowalski's voice had lost all pretense of concern. "That's far enough, Marcus. Step away from the unstable snow and let's talk like civilized people. The second shot would be more accurate. Marcus looked into Elena's eyes one final time, seeing in them not the woman he'd lost, but the truth he'd finally found. The fracture beckoned, a doorway into impossible physics, where the rules of life and death became negotiable, where justice might be possible, even for crimes hidden in the spaces between worlds. Together? He asked Amy. She smiled with the fierce joy of someone who'd finally remembered her purpose. Together. Hand in hand, Marcus and Amy stepped into the suspended avalanche, into the frozen moment of Elena's death, as Jake Kowalski's shouts of rage and frustration echoed behind them through the storm. The moment Marcus and Amy crossed the threshold into the suspended avalanche, reality collapsed into chaos. The frozen debris field wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trap. The instant their feet touched the suspended snow, Marcus felt the fracture's true nature, an endless loop of Elena's final moments, playing and replaying with mechanical precision. The avalanche roared to life around them, tons of snow and rock resuming their deadly descent, only to freeze mid-fall and begin again. And again. And again. Marcus! Amy's scream was lost in the thunder of cascading snow as the loop reset for the fourth time in 30 seconds. Each cycle dragged them deeper into the fracture's gravitational pull, further from the world of the living, where Jake Kowalski waited with his rifle. But Elena was nowhere to be found. The woman who had guided them here, who had promised answers and justice, had vanished the moment they entered her death moment. Marcus realized with growing horror that she couldn't exist within the fracture itself. She was the fracture, her consciousness scattered across every grain of falling snow, every tumbling boulder, every splintering tree. "We're trapped," Amy gasped as the avalanche reset again. With each cycle, she looked less solid, more translucent. The fracture was absorbing her, pulling her consciousness apart to fuel its endless repetition. Marcus tried to move toward the edge they'd entered through, but the suspended debris shifted to block his path. This wasn't random terrain. It was a predator, feeding on their life force to sustain its impossible existence. And with every loop he felt pieces of himself being pulled away, memories of sunshine, the taste of coffee, the simple pleasure of breathing clean air. Outside the fracture, Jake Kowalski's voice cut through the supernatural storm. 30 years I've been perfecting this system, Marcus. 30 years of feeding the mountain exactly what it needs to keep these fractures stable. You think Elena's the only one trapped in there? You think she's the strongest consciousness in that frozen hell? Marcus felt the truth, like a knife between his ribs. Elena wasn't controlling the fracture. She was battling something much older and hungrier, something that had been claiming victims, long before Jake Kowalski learned to weaponize these supernatural anomalies. Amy collapsed as the avalanche reset again, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. "Marcus," she whispered, "I can see them all. Everyone who died here, everyone who's been fed to this thing. It's not just Elena's death. It's every death that's ever happened in these mountains, all compressed into one endless moment of destruction." The spirits Marcus had seen following them were pressed against the fracture's boundaries, unable to enter but desperate to help. David Reeves and Clara Henley and dozens of others, all victims of Jake's hunting spree, all trapped in their own smaller fractures throughout the mountains. But they were powerless against the ancient hunger that predated human presence in these peaks. Another rifle shot cracked outside, followed by Jake's laughter. "The beauty of it, Marcus, is that you did this to yourself. All I had to do was plant the right suggestions, create the right opportunities. You walked Elena into that fracture zone just like you walked yourself into this one." The avalanche reset, and this time Marcus felt Elena's presence, not as the woman he'd loved, but as something vast and desperate, and slowly losing the battle against the mountain's endless appetite for death. She was trying to protect him and Amy from complete absorption, but the effort was tearing her apart, spreading her consciousness thinner with each cycle. "Can't. Hold it." Much longer, her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, fragmented across the falling snow. "You have to choose, Marcus. Save Amy, or save me, but not both." Marcus looked at Amy, who was barely corporeal now. her form dissolving into wisps of snow-caught light. She met his eyes with understanding and nodded toward the fracture's edge. "She's been protecting people for 3 years," Amy said. "Don't let that be for nothing." The choice crystallized with brutal clarity. He could pour his living energy into the fracture, strengthen Elena enough to maintain her protective barrier, but doing so would trap him here forever, while Amy faded to nothing. Or he could use his connection to the living world to pull Amy out, but without Elena's protection, Jake would kill them both and continue feeding victims to the fractures for years to come. Outside, Jake Kowalski was setting up equipment, not rescue gear, but something that would destabilize the fracture entirely, collapse it in a way that would kill everyone trapped inside while appearing to be a natural avalanche to any future investigation. As the loop reset one final time, Marcus felt the weight of every life he'd failed to save, every search that had ended in disappointment, every victim of Jake's decades-long hunting spree. The mountain had won. The predator would continue, feeding. All seemed lost.